Good evening, and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm Hammi. I'll be your host tonight and every other night. On Let's Just Talk with Hammi, we strive to bring nuance and complexity back to public discourse by engaging and putting different scholars from across disciplines in conversation with one another to address and give their perspective on the issues that truly matter. Today's topic is the second Trump impeachment and the events of January 6th. To offer some perspective on these issues, we are joined today by esteemed scholars Dr. James Sieja from the Government Department and Dr. Stephen Barnard from the Sociology Department. He is the author or co author of two books and is currently working on a new book about propaganda and other forms of problematic information work in the contemporary media environment. Dr. Barnard has also published a number of op eds about these topics, often focusing on social and political implications of Trump's use of media. At St. Lawrence, he teaches a number of classes on media and politics, including courses on culture and identity, surveillance and social movements, journalism and public sphere, and the problem of so called fake news. Today, Dr. Barnard will be addressing the broader social and political implications of these two events, along with Trump's power and impact through media. We are also joined by Dr. James Sieja, who is an assistant professor in the government department at St. Lawrence. His research interest centers on the U.S. federal court system, specifically the selection, nomination, and confirmation processes for lower court judges. He has co-authored published works on the process of Supreme Court case selection and the election-related conspiracy theories. Professor Sieja regularly teaches Intro to American Government, the American Legal System, the Presidency, Constitutional Law, and Research Methods. He has published op-eds on the politics of replacing the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, constitutional amendments regarding court packing, and the second Trump impeachment. Dr. Sieja will be addressing the constitutionality of the impeachment proceedings. They both will talk about accountability and holding, or in other words, holding our elected officials accountable. And he will be also addressing the effects of the events of January 6th on our democracy. Thank you. And to begin, each scholar is going to have 5 minutes to introduce their perspective on the issues at hand. We're going to start with the constitutional expert, and then we're going to go over to media. Dr. Sieja, take it away.
Thanks, Hammi, and thanks to the production team here that's putting this on. I think this is a wonderful idea, and I think it'll do a lot of good um, overall. So, as Hammi said, um, I'm here to talk about at least in part something that I study and teach, which is the constitutionality of what went on in the second Trump impeachment, as well as the effects of January 6th on American democracy. Um, Briefly, I'll just say I think the constitutionality of the second Trump impeachment is complex. It's easy to say everything that happened was right or everything that happened was constitutionally wrong. Um, I think over the course of this conversation, I'll try to present a nuanced view of what was right, what was wrong from a constitutional perspective, and recognizing that this is based on this analysis is based on current understanding, best understanding of the Constitution, but that understanding can shift and shift wildly over time. So, uh, real briefly, what went right? Um, I think it was constitutionally appropriate to hold a trial where the House got to make its arguments and the former president's defenders got to make their arguments. I think moving to a vote was improper. Moving to a vote to convict or acquit was improper, and I think the possible availability of prohibiting former President Trump from being president again was also constitutionally improper. But we can expand more on that in the discussion. As for the effects of January 6th on democracy, that's going to be an empirical question as we move forward. I think the worst things that could have happened have not yet happened, because I think the worst things that could have happened would have been a domestic response to shut down certain basic freedoms nationwide for ultimately what was a highly localized, highly extemporaneous event based around one particular thing going on in Washington at the same time. So, so far, I'm pleased to see that backlash hasn't happened. But if January 6th were used as justification for intrusive, if we go back to 2003 and the Patriot Act, going into people's library rental history. I guess people don't go to libraries anymore, do they? But people's search histories, things like that, and essentially trying to create a climate of like pre-crime or something in the name of security would be a dangerous road to go down. But we're still living in the aftermath. I haven't seen very much in the way of going that way. So I think to the extent that, what American democracy was on January 5th isn't very much different from what it is today. That's not to say that it's great, but that January 6th hasn't had perhaps some of the more profound effects it could have. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to the host.
Thank you. So we're gonna give the floor to Dr. Stephen Barnard so he can give us his take on the issues.
So let me just echo what Professor Sieja said. Thanks to all of you all for organizing this, and certainly to Hammi for the invitation. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. Glad this is happening. I come at this obviously from a bit of a different angle than Professor Sieja does. As a sociologist and a scholar of media, I'm more interested in how we got to this point where there be a violent insurrection on our nation's capital, and what are the implications of those events will be, or currently will be for the future. So in regards to the first point, I think we first sort of have to take a stock of our history to acknowledge that political violence and extremism didn't just show up out of nowhere. And so to think about, for example, if the State Department just recently formally acknowledged right-wing extremism as a threat to our nation's security, although people who've been studying right-wing extremists, for example, have been saying that that's been a threat for some time. We also have to sort of pay attention to what's new about some of those developments. And I think we're just thinking about the rise of that type of extremism. I think the election of Barack Obama and some of the subsequent sort of advances towards racial, gender, and other forms of inclusiveness across much of our public discourse, not that we don't have a long way to go in a lot of those efforts, but I think we've seen progress on a number of them, and I think that progress, or perceived progress, has sort of called white supremacists to action. We've also seen the Republican Party shift further to the right on a number of issues over the past few decades. Similar things could be said about the Democratic Party shifting to the left, but a lot of objective measures of that show further polarization to the right than to the left, at least by the bulk of the party, including elected politicians, not just citizens. media have also been airing more extreme views, and I think that's both a mixture of cause and effect, and whether or not that is sort of resonated in the public. We could think about outlets like Fox News and One American Network and Newsmax and Sinclair Broadcasting and other sort of popular media broadcasting channels. We could think about digital media startups like Breitbart and Daily Wire and Daily Caller and Good Funded and countless others that are sort of lining up further to the right of Fox News and sort of pushing an audience online. We've seen, of course, social media outlets, Facebook and Twitter, of course, but also Parler and Gab and Telegraph as sort of social media platforms, and then message boards like Reddit and 4chan and 8chan and other kind of more fringe message boards where people are sharing information, and some of that's false or highly questionable. Those platforms sometimes incentivize or even help amplify extremist content. I should say they often incentivize and help amplify that content, helping them reach a wider audience. Of course, then there's Trump himself, who is perhaps the most effective media president, I would say, since FDR and his famous fireside chats, and maybe even more so. His words and his actions have re-emboldened white supremacists. He's used racist and xenophobic rhetoric as dog whistles. The sort of statement of stand back and stand by to the Proud Boys are kind of two very clear examples. A report by ABC News that I found saw that they identified at least 54 criminal cases where Trump was invoked in direct connection with either violent acts or threats of violence and allegations of assault, which is evidence to suggest that his words have consequences. But for today's conversation, I think it's more important maybe that we think about how we use this platform to undermine trust in establishment institutions. And maybe that's something we can come back to more later, but his sort of erosion of trust in the press and of science and of democratic institutions like the voting process are important. And I think all of those things culminated in the events of January 6th, where the mob stormed the Capitol. We're going to learn more about that as an investigation continues. And certainly we've seen others that were inspired by those statements. We could easily read Trump's impeachment as a media spectacle, as an opportunity for people on both sides of the aisle, if you will, to grandstand and to get sort of their message across. And I think to some extent that's true and perhaps resonates with some of the things that Professor Sieja was saying about the questionable constitutionality of the actions. But of course, then there's the questions about what the implications of January 6th are. And for many, I think it is the trust in American institutions and how much that's been eroded. Right? For months before the election, Trump was saying that the only way that he would lose is if it was stolen. And I think that is something that he used establishment media and social media to sort of push that message. That trust is going to be really hard to rebuild. And I think when we add that to the fact that social media, as we know, will probably never be the same after Trump getting kicked off. 70,000 conspiracy theorist accounts on Twitter alone were kicked off, roughly at the same time that Trump was. And so we're seeing a shift in our political sphere, in our media sphere, and certainly in the broader public sphere. And I think we as a public have a lot of questions, a lot of hard questions to be asking ourselves. I think many are starting to question whether or not the idea of American exceptionalism is actually true. And I think many are already asking that question. But watching these things play out and getting over the shock of that on the date of January 6th, I think we're now starting to come to terms with maybe just what that really means for the state of American democracy today.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Barnard. Before we even delve into the magnitude of the conversation that we're talking about, we agree for the purposes of this conversation, what do we call the events of January 6th? Is it a terrorist attack? Is it an insurrection? Is it a mob violence? I don't know. What do we call it? Can we agree on a term? From both a political science perspective and a sociology perspective.
I feel like we should write it down and turn it on the
So I think, how about I count to three and then you just shout out what you think.
Well, Professor Barnard has already revealed his position.
Right.
He called it an insurrection.
Okay.
I would call it a riot. I don't know that there's much of a difference except, intent maybe. So I should just, my colleague in the government department, Professor Shelley McConnell, who studies Latin America, where this sort of thing happens a lot, and they have lots of words in the study of Latin American politics for the sorts of gradations of things that go on.
Right.
Unfortunately, I didn't follow up with her on what she thought it was.
Right.
But I believe her position is that it's not quite an insurrection. Yeah, that's why I go with Riot. But yeah, it's
So what disqualifies this event from being a terrorist attack on the Capitol? Because the question I'm trying to, the point that I'm trying to get at is this is a group of predominantly white males, and is there a change of rhetoric from scholars and the media because they're a group of white males, or is there something inherently different about what they did from what will qualify it to be a terrorist attack?
I think it's a good question. I agree with Professor Sieja that the line is a very fuzzy line, and we're talking about a distinction. Many would say maybe even a semantic distinction. I think your point, Hammi, is to say that it's more than semantic to some degree if we because words are political and they have consequences in terms of how we understand them.
Right.
I think many, and I was thinking about addressing this, and I chose not to in my opening statement about those who were intentionally there to attack the Capitol, which there is lots of evidence. We're learning more as the investigation of those of that day continues. That there was much organization going on by I think a minority of the people who were present that day, but probably the most consequential minority of the people who were present that day.
Right.
And I think to that extent, it was at least an insurrection, and I think there were by many definitions of the word, terrorists there intending to engage in that action. So do I think everyone who was there that day was a terrorist?
Right.
No, I think many were there as protesters, and many did not engage in violent action and did not invade the Capitol. But I certainly think that there was terrorism and insurrection involved. But I guess it depends who we're talking about.
The entire event, you wouldn't categorize the entire event itself, or rather fragments of it.
Yeah, I think
as it
that's
says.
it.
And then Dr. Sieja would be your point of view on this?
So I think in the political science literature, the distinguishing characteristic of a terror attack is that its political objective is not usually, often, exclusively against the actual political leaders, right? A terrorist attack is targeted towards everyday citizens to instill terror in them going forward, right? And to elicit a response from the elected leaders or unelected leaders to respond to that, even though it's kind of an indirect influence where if you're storming the Capitol, that's as direct as you can get, I think. So I think, at least in my discipline, that's where we would distinguish a terrorist attack versus something else.
So the reason I asked the question, before we get into the constitutionality and why you believe the impeachment itself of conviction, the ability of Congress or the Senate to convict would lack standing. Before we get into that, the reason I ask this question is because history matters, right? And if we go back to the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, that was a group of white males that were dissatisfied with the system in which they lived. And then we go back to the Reconstruction era with Grant, President Grant, and what the Ku Klux Klan was doing in that time because of the dissatisfaction with the society in which they lived in. Could that be somehow connected to today's event to kind of get rid of the idea of like, this is not us, this is not the America that we know? And so what is your point of view on that? And then we'll jump into constitutionality.
There's a lot to that question, probably more than we can unpack in this format, but.
Right, so let's take 1 to 2 minutes each, because we gotta be cognizant of time as well.
Yeah, I think absolutely history matters, and I think that many of the people who were storming the Capitol, and certainly the ones that were organizing that attack, were not necessarily thinking about American history when they were doing it, or if they were invoking American history in very selective and revisionist ways. But
Does that matter?
I think it matters for lots of reasons.
Okay.
But I think you're right to say that there are other moments in history in which political violence has been used to advance the goal. And I agree, by the way, with the distinction that Mr. was making in terms of motive and target and how those things matter. They don't much matter in terms of outcome, perhaps, but they matter in terms of intent, and that to some extent is a distinction worth making. But I think the history of political violence, especially if we think about, as you said, Hammi, the dissatisfaction that a certain population has to the point where they are so moved to violence, is absolutely an event that is historicized and is actually a part, I think, of that issue that I was mentioning earlier about American exceptionalism.
Right.
I think we like to say that we are a peaceful nation, quote unquote, while ignoring many of the countless instances in which peace is not the defining state of this country, and I think that's yet another.
Thank you for that. And then Dr. Sieja, what would you like to say on that?
Yeah, I think clan violence is a great example of terrorism.
Right.
As terrorism, right? Klan targets individual citizens to strike fear in the wider community.
Right.
So Oklahoma City bombing is sort of a border case. Where I would say it's clearly terrorism is that bureaucrats aren't, and that's who mostly was in the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, aren't elected officials. They don't make policy on their own, legally speaking. So that would have the symbolic importance of the building is there, but the intent there is more. We can do a lot of damage on any given day, right? Which is much more in line with terrorism than an organized attempt to, at the end, overthrow the government. Whatever the purpose there was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for the sake of time, we're going to move on from this question, and hopefully. Not hopefully, but the more investigations that are there, we'll get to see whether or not there's actually an organized unit that planned this somehow to get to where we are today. But for right now, I'm going to go to an article that you wrote on February 6, 2021, or was published on that date, entitled Impeachment Impossibility.
I really don't like that title.
Yeah.
It wasn't me. You give it to people, they write the title.
I was just teaching my students about that, how the authors often don't get to control the titles of their pieces.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to quote you. You say that impeaching Trump would be wrong, constitutionally speaking. And you said this before Congress had deliberated on the issue. Or the Senate, whatever the difference.
The Senate.
The Senate had deliberated on the issue. And then you also added 45 Republicans recently voted that his second Trump impeachment trial in itself is unconstitutional. They are incorrect. So, why did you take this position? Because this is a position that actually ended up being the reality of things and how things ended up happening.
Sure. I don't know that there's observational equivalence between my position and reality, is what I'd say. Since we're bringing nuance back to debate, I'll put it that way. I have my Constitution with me. We have to. The first part about Republicans being wrong to say that the whole process was unconstitutional comes from two passages. Article 1, Section 2 says the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. The plain meaning of that is that the House gets to impeach whoever they want, whenever they want. Okay. And then Article 1, Section 3 is that the Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments. Sole power means that the Senate can hear anything the House brings over as an impeachment.
Right.
Okay, so that's what makes Republicans wrong to say that the process was unconstitutional in itself. That power is given to the House and Senate. They can do it. But what makes the possibility of conviction unconstitutional comes from Article 2, Section 4, where it says the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for, among other things, high crimes and misdemeanors. Because Trump could not have been removed from office after January 20th, he had already left office voluntarily. That removes the House's standing to bring the case because the Senate can't provide the constitutionally required remedy to them. And that remedy is there because judgment in impeachment, back to Article 1, Section 3, judgment in the cases of impeachment can't extend further than removal from office, but the party convicted shall be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. So the purpose of impeachment is to get the person out of office so the civil criminal authorities can punish them to the fuller extent of the law, to restrict their liberty, put them in jail, whatever. Because President Trump voluntarily left office, the purpose of removal is just undermined completely. Now, there is one other thing, one other part that I intentionally skipped over. Judgments in cases of impeachment can also extend to disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. The idea that Trump, the Senate could say, we're not going to let Trump be president anymore. My argument, and I'll put it briefly because I think we got time, is that that provision cannot apply to the office of president or becoming a senator or representative. It only applies to executive branch positions or judicial positions.
So you're saying that particular quote don't apply to the office of the president.
Right.
Okay. So 57 senators did not agree with or voted against the logic, the reasoning that you just put forth.
Sure.
And 43 agreed. So I guess the question that I'm asking is, what makes them wrong in this situation, which you've answered in part, and then how do we come to terms with the fact that with what this means symbolically to the country, as in he won't be held accountable and he won't be subject to legal proceedings, and he can run for office again if we are all agreeing that Trump is in part responsible for inciting the events of January 6th. So how do we then hold him accountable if your argument is that the Senate lacks standing to offer any remedies?
The accountability mechanism is easy. Don't vote for him if he runs again. That's how you hold him politically accountable. It's up to prosecutors in New York City, Washington, D.C., they can bring criminal charges against a now private citizen, Trump. The Constitution sets up the political punishment for presidents, senators, representatives as us not voting for them.
Right. And so the other question that I had is that so Senator McConnell said something similar to what you just said, as in, I think he even stated President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. Now, I don't want to speak to the hypocrisy of McConnell, as in the impeachment. Trump was impeached 6 days while he was in office, as a week earlier, and he prevented the Senate from coming back together to hold these proceedings. So one could argue that he knew where he was going with this as a constitutional expert himself. And so I guess the question that I'm raising this time around is 4 people died as a result of these events. 5 people?
I think it was 5 citizens and the police officer.
Okay, so 5. Okay, so the number. So those are big numbers, and symbolically, this is the hub of the United States government. And so, what message does this send if Congress can't do anything about it? And that goes to media as well. Like how do we look to the rest of the world to say that our government itself cannot do anything about a president inciting violence against the United States government, and that he or she can just wait out the clock or resign and be absolved from.
So they're not absolved, right? Like once they resign, they can be held criminally accountable. That's why Gerald Ford had to pardon Richard Nixon in order for Nixon to stay out of jail. So if a DC prosecutor wants to bring charges against President Trump, they can. There would be no executive immunity or anything that would apply. So that avenue is still open.
Right.
Yes.
And so now I'm gonna come back to our media expert. So you've written a lot of articles on Trump, and one of your articles titled "Trump Can't Block Twitter Users, but he can still use it for divisive rhetoric."
Also don't like that.
I'm gonna quote you directly. You say Trump remains committed to his divisive rhetoric, and you wrote that in the 15th in 2019, the 15th of the 7th month in 2019. Yes, that was way before this insurrection stuff happened in 2020. So, could you take us through Trump's use of social media, the power he has, and how he may or may not have been sort of responsible for what happened on January 6th?
Oh, where to start? I mean, Trump's. Okay, I'll be quiet. I'll be brief. So Trump's use of Twitter and other social media is infamous. I don't need to say much about how unorthodox his style has been as a politician and certainly as a media celebrity. Right? He came to politics as a celebrity, as a reality TV show. And that's why I was saying that I think he is the most savvy media politician, perhaps in our nation's history. His use of Twitter, in my first book, I have a chapter looking at Trump's use of Twitter in comparison to activist use of Twitter and members of the press's use of Twitter. And it was interesting to me to see that not only did Trump have a larger reach, a bigger influence on that platform, which is not surprising to anyone who knows how popular or unpopular, both of which are attention, that he is. But in addition to that, many of his followers, even if they disliked him, especially in my analysis, many of the people who he was already more influential than, the sort of political journalists, were then amplifying his words. They were using the things that he said even to correct him or to tell him that he was wrong or that he was dangerous. They were still amplifying his words. And in fact, that is something that political extremists have become very savvy at in recent years in our media, is often what's described as media manipulation. And one of the strategies of media manipulation is to say things that are intentionally sensational, shocking, in order to get that attention. And so, for example, during the final presidential debate, when the moderator said the Proud Boys, me and I'm sure many others were sort of cringing because they just gave free advertising to an extremist group. And I think any time that establishment media amplifies those messages, they are doing the same thing. And I think Trump's use, not only we could look at his rhetoric, the types of things that he said, and start to parse to what extent that may have inspired or otherwise sort of contributed to some of the unrest and anger that led to the attack on the Capitol, but just simply to acknowledge that the use of media in that way is further. Not only, of course, he's retweeted lots of extremist groups and conspiracy groups and all other types of sort of amplifying their messages, but media, professional media, even those in the center and on the left, have amplified his. And in that sense, he's used every channel of media that I can think of, and his supporters have to some extent as well, in pretty successful ways.
So in that sense, would you say that the manipulation of social media in a negative way by influencers include politicians in this case, because people of my generation see influencers as like Taylor Swift. But so just to make that clear, like politicians to be a threat to American democracy. Yes or no in short answers? Or is it more complex?
It's more complicated than yes or no. I mean, influencers, in sort of the longer history of political science and political sociology, they're often talked about as thought leaders or opinion leaders, and people who have that type of influence on the public. There's different theories and different evidence to demonstrate that their effects may be more or less robust, but nevertheless, certainly people who have a large audience and who have authority or legitimacy to some extent, in formal or informal ways, have, many would say, a responsibility to the public and to the society in which they live, in order to comport themselves in ways that are sort of deserving of the standing. And I think in many ways, people's criticism of so-called influencers who betray some of those values to suggest that they get quote unquote canceled is in many ways another accountability mechanism that society has. It's not a legal one, but it's one that says if you abuse or misuse this power, then the society will respond with consequences. And I think that's an example of that.
I won't get into cancel culture because that's a whole another topic for another time. But for the sake of time, I think we have about 10 minutes. So I want to talk about briefly the fragility of democracy. In the beginning, when I mentioned the impact on American democracy, Dr. Sieja, you briefly spoke about the ramifications for the American people, who the vast majority of them had nothing to do with January 6th. But I think I was looking at it from a different perspective, as in democracy is based on good faith principles, right? And so if that's a premise that we agree with, and we all heard former President Trump's phone call with with the people in Georgia, saying, "I just need 11,780 votes," right? In the likelihood that somebody gave him those 11,780 votes, because we came close, and we got to remember the gravity of that itself, that a sitting president asked that to people. And then we had an attorney general, William Barr, who had made it clear at the time that he is the president's personal lawyer, which is something that we may or may not agree with.
Would you call him a wingman?
I mean, we can say that.
I'm just saying because that's how Eric Holder described himself
to Obama. Right. So we can go back and look at Eric Holder and the way he described himself. The behaviors are very similar. But what I'm trying to say is that a president asked for 11,780 votes to overturn the democratic process, and we had a an attorney general who might have considered himself a wingman. What does this mean for American democracy if this all of this were to go south? Because it simply could have turned into yes instead of no, we cannot do this. Give us a political science perspective and any take that you have on any kind of advice that you have for the future. And you can also give us a sociology perspective on this, and we can wrap up.
Sure. So I'll go back to the beginning of the question about democracy being founded on good faith. I think a necessary corollary of that is that democracy is a good system for resolving conflicts when you're not sure you're right, because then you're willing to lose. And I think over the last few election cycles, and this goes to my work on my very brief work on conspiracy theories as they relate to the election uh, or elections. Um, it's really neat to see people before the election. Everyone pretty much agrees that the election is going to be on the up and up. After the election, whoever loses becomes a conspiracy theorist, right? And among the losers, there are folks who have sort of a predisposition towards conspiratorial thinking. Um, if just to put it bluntly, if you were looking for a Russian under every bed from 2016 to 2020, that's a conspiracy theory on the left. If you're talking about Dominion voting machines in late 2020 and 2021, that's and I don't mean to use conspiracy theory pejoratively, because just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, right? Um, but um, but yeah, I think one thing that we've lost over my lifetime is a willingness to lose, right? Bob Dole got curb stomped in 1996, and that's what happened. Um, but I think given the closeness of most recent elections, um, that also gives rise to an unwillingness to lose. I think the change in the media environment to a very presentist view, just exalting the thing that is happening right now to the exclusion of everything else, um, also makes it very important that we win every time and never lose, which I think is a pretty big threat to democracy when the losers aren't willing aren't willing to lose. I think that's and that stems. I'll briefly say this. Say briefly, from a conviction that whatever views I hold cannot be wrong.
Right.
If you place zero probability on the idea that you might be wrong, democracy is not your system. There are other systems available that are much better for that view than democracy.
So in conclusion, we have to be we have to be okay with the idea that our own cherished beliefs may be wrong.
Yep.
Yeah, let me just pick up there and say I certainly agree that that actions that suggest that that there is sort of some fundamentalist belief in any particular principle, let alone the principle that an entire ideology is fully correct, is more aligned with authoritarian forms of rule than democratic forms of rule. I think many people were concerned about more authoritarian rhetoric and thinking over the past number of years for precisely these reasons, that we're seeing some rise in that type of belief system. But I want to come back to a couple of things that sort of were mentioned that to me are interesting. One of them is to think about, as Professor Sieja said earlier, what the worst case scenario would have been from January 6th.
Right.
I personally don't think, I don't disagree that it would be unfortunate and negative if we saw a further erosion of Americans' rights or immigrants' rights or other groups' rights, save for maybe a few exceptions. Thinking of, for example, Second Amendment rights and the ability to bring weapons into places that maybe some might say is unnecessary. But without barring some of those, I think I absolutely agree that a loss of rights would have been a loss for the country as a result of that. However, I don't think, from my view, that would necessarily be a worst case scenario. I think even maybe a worst case scenario would be a successful coup, of course, or and probably a much more nuanced version of that would just be a further erosion and a distrust of democracy in other Americans. And I think what we've seen is that January 6th emboldened that in ways that we still don't know the effects of. And again, I agree it's an empirical question. We don't have an answer to it. But it seems to be that people, for I think understandable reasons, have even less trust in others across political divides. And I think this gets back to that question of action in good faith. A lot of what's happened in our public discourse in recent years, I think, has been an assertion, sometimes warranted and sometimes perhaps not, that the people whom they're debating or disagreeing with are not acting in good faith. And that is a very dangerous assumption to make when in fact that is false. Right. It's a dangerous assumption to make as a matter of course prior to engagement. I think there are many times when people are arguing in bad faith without. You can see our media play false equivalence and say, well, the Republicans say this, the Democrats say that. You as the audience get to decide. I think in many ways that gets to some of the deeper flaws in American or other forms of democracy to some extent. That it is, it's up to the public to decide, but the public is not fully rational, or many times may not be rational at all. And that's the real wrinkle I think that we're dealing with. And if we think about the role that media play in furthering the spread of all types of problematic information and all types of good information and everything in between, we have a mess in front of us. And while some of it is normal and is expected and is written into the history of this country and our form of government, there are many other parts of it that I think are new and are more challenging than they've ever been before. And even if we are not more divided today, in some ways, than we were in previous eras of this country, the manner of that divide and the informational and communicative means through which we understand ourselves and understand each other are perhaps more challenging than ever. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying, and that doesn't mean that that those debates and discussions are not really the real answer, because absolutely, if not for democracy, what do we have?
Right. So democracy matters, dialogue matters, especially dialogue across difference. I want to thank both of you all for coming today and giving us your perspective. I would get up and shake your hands, but we're living during coronavirus times. So I'm not going to do that, but you have my utmost gratitude.
Long distance this one?
Yes. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. All right.
Hey, if you stayed till the end of that video, I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to our channel and leave a thumbs up. Also, follow our Instagram page, the link in the description below. Just do it. It only takes 1 second. Just do it. Just do it.